Just a moment of attention, please. Anne-Sophie is a caseworker at the Marie Enfant Center since 2014. She first has a social service studies and a master's degree also in social service at UQAM. Her brief is transition towards adult care for youth with a neuromuscular disease, the perspective from parents regarding the autonomy of their child. Hello everyone, I completed my brief recently. Manon Champagne also was my director. I will split my presentation. First, talking about the problem with regard to transition. Also, I'll speak about the methodology and then results and analysis. When talking about transition, well, transition is quite a broad term, but with the breakthroughs of medicine, we have more severely sick children who survive into adulthood, and we can go further in oncology. Rather in palliative care, the average age of children is 19 years old, meaning that there's a big shift in modern medicine, and this is from 2011. People with a Duchenne muscular dystrophy die well beyond youth, sometimes in their 30s, and that is very different now. There's not much literature on the transition of neuromuscular disease, people affected by this. I then looked into other orphan diseases, also other severe chronic diseases. What comes out of this, of literature, is that complex diseases have several conditions in the lives and organization of families that has an impact on physical and effective emotional health of everyone. The family, emotional, social life is impoverished. There's very little support for families, and also there's, of course, emotional and professional effects. Here's a quote from Champagne and Al. With the ambulatory shift that wants to reduce hospital time and rather have home stays, support from children severely sick and receiving complex care is more and more up to families. For severe orphan diseases, Champagne and Mongeau also looked into the experience of children and their parents. They came up with 7 elements in research. First, that parents are not very prepared to the transition of the sick children. Also, families are isolated. They want to have more info. Also, families go through losses, tangible or symbolic. Families have to deal with pediatric and the shift into adult care. Families are looking into support services, materials support also, and parents, despite all of their experience, are socially mobilized. We can think about the recent fights for exceptional care and subsidies. So despite their conditions, they're very much mobilized in socially. I looked into literature on those who suffer from Duchenne disease. Hamdani looked into the best practices in Canada. I think there were 4, and they compared it with the experiences of these youth. They conducted interviews with these youth, and in the guide there's a big promotion of independence. The young person should be encouraged to take care to be self-independent. And of course, young people also, when talking about it, it is in line with guides. They want to be independent. We encourage all of this. However, when we look more closely, we notice that young people talk about care and the support they receive from the family. So there's somewhat of two dialogues. They want to reproduce, these young people, the normative path, such as leaving the family and entering the workplace, but then they are not really moving out from their family's home, and there's a difference between what they say and what they do. These young people internalize this willingness, but it's hard to externalize. Trans and Al also interviewed Duchenne, those affected by Duchenne disease, and they created a documentary. So from the interview, this documentary was presented at an expert meeting, I think in Amsterdam in 2011, and their paper was published in 2012. Following discussion, 6 recommendations were issued. The first one is that the discussion on taboo topics should be favored and encouraged during transition, and then transition should be also thought of much earlier. Also, to promote resilience of these young people, to give necessary information at the right moment. The young person should also be supported with regard to their physical appearance. This is something that came up during the study. And also the 6th point that was mentioned is that we should find what was supportive for these young people so that they can transition into adulthood. Then, when we look at transition, we see autonomy scattered everywhere in text, and we notice that in literature it can be mentioned either as an objective to reach or an obstacle, but it can also be seen as a priority need. We see here Racine said that the recognition of autonomy as a principle that currently guides current support services. In society, we see that there is injunction to autonomy. We always talk about autonomy. It's everywhere. The individual autonomy, it became a supreme value, and is a matter of self-organization, and also it's part of the social and political debate. These people are losing autonomy, functional autonomy, but despite this current landscape, around adulthood, there is this transition. Several stakeholders and institutions think that these young people should develop their autonomy. It's really a central part of this, and all the social and political debate is centered around autonomy. For these young people, the paradox is huge because individual autonomy seems like an ideal, but functionally it will be very hard and impossible to reach. We see that performance also and success is very much important values because of individualism in society. This is in link with Marie-José's research. What is the vision, the perception of parents with regard to their child's autonomy during transition? The 5 objectives now that I want to address during my master's thesis, I want to know how parents experience transition into adult care of their children, how parents define autonomy generally, but also more specifically during transition. I want to explore also difficulties in facilitating, mitigating elements experienced in the daily basis by parents regarding autonomy. Also to analyze the paradox of gaining autonomy with regard to age, but losing autonomy with regard to the functional aspects of the disease. Also wanted to explore perceptions from parents. In order to do so, we need a proper framework, and I chose very quickly symbolic interactionism. This is based on 3 premises. First, that individuals act depending on the meaning that objects and people have for them. Also, these meanings come from social interactions and communication. Thirdly, these meanings can be modified by the perception and interpretation of the individual. What I wanted to look into was the meaning that parents gave to autonomy during transition. Reality is based on the social construct that is modulated by stakeholders, and meaning is given then during interactions when stakeholders influence reality by their interaction. So it can be quite complex. What is transition, and then what is autonomy? These are also two themes that I looked into. Transition, well, I look into the Blum's definition and the 2010 text from Mellor. Transition would be a purposeful planned process that addresses the medical, psychosocial, and educational vocational needs of adolescents and young adults with chronic physical and mental condition as they move from child-centered to adult-oriented healthcare systems. It's more than a transfer of data. It's a really psychosocial, educational, and very broad spectrum of areas. On this question of transition, I explored once again the framework, and I saw the developmental perspective. That's also called the family life cycle. It is made up of several development stages. Each family goes through them, and each stage is associated with challenges and things that need to be met and addressed. They're not very important except for the first one, which is the young single adult leaving home. We can question ourselves, what do young people with neuromuscular diseases do? How do they experience this? All families go through this, but young people who have these diseases also experience this. For them, tasks are even more complicated. When the young single adult needs to leave the family home, it's also a relational challenge because there needs to be a differentiation between parents and himself, and the goal will be to reach full autonomy. We see also this model in society. We can make a parallel with transition when the 18-year-old a young person is transitioning to adult care with a different culture. There can be a parallel between the transition to adult care and the life cycle of families. Then, autonomy. We can define it in different ways. It's studied in several disciplines. We can look in philosophy and psychology and etc. But I looked into it as autonomy, such as the designation of a capacity of an individual to determine his own behavior. It's a concept that is more and more present. More specifically on autonomy. For young people experiencing disability or physical difficulties, where you can see models in literature. There's opposing models. First, the biomedical model opposed to social model. In biomedical, the autonomy of the person is assessed with regard to what the person cannot do anymore. It's a label linked with incapacities or disabilities, and it is a loss of autonomy. The loss of autonomy is used frequently. The loss of autonomy is oftentimes used. The objective of biomedical is to make the person, the individual, more autonomous. The social model is the incapacity from the social environment that is taken into account. It's a collective social responsibility. So the social context needs to be adapted so that everyone can occupy the same space. It's the context that creates the disability. Dependency versus interdependency. Dependency is incapacity to do daily life tasks by yourself. Interdependency is a person that is breaking down from a physical standpoint because of a disease that redistributes different links and networks of relations that are morphing or transforming. In a medical decision-making standpoint, this is opposed to a relational standpoint. And individualism, the patient is not basing the decision on the family, but rather with himself. It's focused on information from the doctor, for example. With this information, the patient can make an informed decision that is seen as independent. As part of this, the patient is able to go beyond the effects, whether it is pain or emotion, in order to make a decision, once again as part of a medical context. This is opposed to the relational vision based on the social context of the individual and recognizes the emotional aspect of the patient and also sees intrinsic the decision maker. Discussion is essential, and the discussion with others is part of autonomy. The patient is not only centered around objective facts that are given to him, but also must acknowledge the experience that he goes through, and also the experience from the rest of the family, partner, child, etc. Autonomy is crucial to decision making once again, and the relatives or professionals can also be part of this relational vision. We see the importance of the others. Transition and autonomy. How do we see this? Racine and Al developed a paradigm that's called the personalized transition paradigm. It's quite hard to study transition and autonomy because these are cross-referenced through literature. It is the recognition of the need to tailor transition processes to the individual needs and narrative, as well as self-defined goals and values of the patient. This is what is ever present. Respect for autonomy is valuable to the extent that it is appropriate and possible. A personalized transition is centered around the willingness and wishes of the person. We can even add that because every condition is unique, just as contexts are unique, it's hard to think about designing a transition program that would fit everyone. Research for autonomy is not the central part of transition, but autonomy is part of a broader context. Autonomy is one issue, part of several others. With all this information, I said, well, I'm going to go on the ground, see what is the opinion of parents with regard to transition and autonomy. I made a collaboration with Muscular Dystrophy Canada that broadcast my call for interviews on social network and also by email. I conducted 7 semi-directed interviews. It's a qualitative research. These mothers had to have had experienced the transition in order to have some self-reflection. Also, what I'd like to say is that I interviewed 7 mothers, but I wanted to have parents. All participants were mothers. No fathers answered my advert, but we see that most of also caretakers are mothers. These 7 mothers each had a sick child. Well, they were not children at that moment. They were between 18 and 21 years old, and 1 girl and 6 boys. 4 with Duchenne, 1 spinal amyotrophy, 3 and 2 Friedreich ataxia. 1 was on the autism spectrum, and 1 with a slight intellectual deficiency. I mean, 1 was using a manual wheelchair, 2, and all the rest had a motorized wheelchair. They all attended a special school, some were at higher education, going through higher education studies, and there were variety of situations rather. Also, with regard to social economic levels, it was very different. Some were lower income, and others higher income. I divided my results in 2 sections, transition and then autonomy. What came out is that families are looking for information, they are looking for resources and services. They are using social networks frequently. One of the mothers here, I made a choice to not work full-time. My work now is to be at home and to search how to get by and how to integrate my child. We see looking for information and services is very important, looking for resources. Then mothers also go through tangible and symbolic losses. Challenges can be different depending on parents, as mentioned previously. Some parents had children in a specialized school up to 21 years old, meaning that they saw the medical transition but had readaptation services at school. These parents talked about their fears and worries of leaving that specialized school at 21 years old. Other mothers also talked about losing case workers in pediatrics. They said we need to bond with new people. This mother here talks about the last day, the last appointment at the pediatrics readaptation pediatrics center, and it shows how she was attached to the personnel, the staff. Oftentimes these diagnoses are made at a very low age or very early on, and so there's a long experience with the staff. And she said that it was hard to leave the center. That day I tried not to think about, not to cry in front of everyone. And it's very hard because we got the diagnosis when he was 4 years old, so 14 years ago. And all these people were great. So she showed how she was attached to all these workers. What comes out is also families need to deal with a shift in culture between childcare and adult care. Adults are a centerfold because they need to manage appointments, fill forms, go through the red tape. It was mentioned. One of the participants appreciated a change of culture. This participant, however, was with a child who was the less severely affected. Here somebody says, well, I was called in pediatrics for an appointment, but never thought about this, but now I need to plan and make appointments a little bit more, meaning that now the parent needs to be more proactive and needs to be more of a active stakeholder. Also, some other mothers are looking for programs constantly. One mother put his child in a long-term care facility. He says that we put him there at 18 years old. We can always do this as many 40 hours a day, and then when back home, give care and run all the time. We put him in a residence, but he was not happy. It lasted for 2 months. We said he's so sad, we need to do something. He said, well, you know what, we'll open a residence. And that's what happened. They opened a residence, a facility, and so they transformed their home, and this was a new occupation for them. I thought it was quite striking. It was now a flexible occupation. Another talk about respite care that stopped at 18 years old, saying that there's no equivalent in adult care, and talk about how long-term care facilities were not adapted, and that she was really feared that approach. Positively, mothers receive new material support. They talked about income security at 18 years old. And transition is indirectly associated to more help from CLSC, some having 3 baths given per week during transition. Is this a cause? Well, I know it was mentioned here. Somebody from the CLSC want for a bath once a week. It was new, but now we did it so that it gives them some respite, some rest, and this is a positive element here. New or services that are given. With regard to social mobility or mobilization, I saw some people who want to get want to mobilize themselves. The mother here on a social network, on Facebook, to name it, says that's why I give a lot to the group on Facebook. I help new mothers and saying, wow, we need to adapt some things, and we see that there's a commitment, social commitment on social networks. Another mother told me that she would like to be a volunteer to help young people who are just by themselves or in transition. It was more of a wish than something that was accomplished. Then I moved to autonomy. When asking them what is autonomy, mothers all say what their child is not able to do anymore. All answer by something that is functional. For example, autonomy for myself is someone who's able to do things by themselves. It's very physical here. However, when questioning more deeply, we talk about decision-making processes, and that the definition of autonomy is not that simple. For example, when I ended up at the CR, adult care, it's as if I did not exist anymore. It is up to my son, who's an adult, to answer, to make decisions. And we see that, it might be relational how decision-making should be made. Another mother talked about the importance of consulting with the relatives before making a decision. We see that right away when asked very directly what is autonomy. That's a biomedical perspective. However, with the decision making, it's more of a relational perspective, the importance of other people to make decisions for their sick child.
Then I looked at what was helpful for their child's autonomy and what was an obstacle. Mothers described all the care they gave to their child, talk about hygiene, feeding, and if the nose scratches, I have to, scratch the nose. So I know that they think about all the numerous details to help the sick child. Some changed their work schedule, one stopped working, and they also have a great worry when the child is not with them. We can see here in the example, I cannot be alone for a long period of time, and I'm worried. When I work, I call during break, during lunch, just so as I know what's going on. So parents are always worried. It has a major impact on the whole family organization. Something that came out very often, it's the environment, the arrangement of the environment can be a difficulty, but it can be helpful. They caught about the architectural barrier outside the home, and that was a major difficulty. We can see this example in the quote. He would have liked to go by himself, get the medication in the pharmacy. He has a street to cross. It's dangerous, impossible. He cannot reach out for the button for pedestrians. So she explained that there was a little bit of mud. The wheelchair couldn't go close enough to press the button, and close to her place, if you don't press the button, the light wouldn't go up. So it was impossible to cross the street. We see the architectural barriers that are a huge obstacle to autonomy. But the opposite, when interior environment is adapted, it's very helpful. We can see here, to have a link, when I talk about the social model of autonomy, we can make a parallel. If the environment would have been adapted, maybe this person could have gone and get his medication. My parents talked about technical and technological tools. That's a very helpful example, is a motorized arm. It helps me every day. That's the mother talking. It helps me. He uses with a stick. I can open the fridge, take juice. It's not depending on someone to do it instead of him. So that's a very good example showing how the technical supports or tools are very useful. Also, the more the child is sick, the more there are technical tools. They talk about electrical sticks to open doors, and this motorized arm to pick up objects or items. These tools are helpful because they can have a control on their environment. Parents also talked about the support network, formal or informal. They talked about the people that are offered by the CLSC. And as an example, there is a work integration program, and the mother said that the child could not go because he was not able to go to the toilet by himself. So that's an exclusion criteria. Even in institutions, there are programs that can be difficulty. Mother also said they were isolated, even with their family, because the residences of the family members are not adapted, not accessible. So when the young people use a wheelchair, even a motorized one, it is very heavy, cannot lift it very easily, and they cannot be able to go and visit the family members as before. Parents talked about the understanding of the surrounding. That can be very limited. A mother said that stakeholders in a network are a difficulty. One worker said that she wanted her to put her child in a residence. The example of the mother, she says that she cannot go in her extended family. It is not adapted if we go to my uncle or aunt. It is quite a challenge. We feel isolated because we don't have access to the things we had access to before, and even with our close ones. So this is a major, major point. I'll talk about the vision of their role as a parent. Since they have a sick child, their perception of their role has changed since they have a child with a handicap. They say, oh, us, and when they talk about the child, we have a wheelchair, okay? We have a wheelchair, talking about the child. It's as if they were included in the disability situation of the child. The mothers also talked about the fact that they cannot be sick. They wonder who will take care of my child if I go to this hospital, if I have a health problem, physical, mental problem. It's as if they could not allow themselves to be sick anymore. And these mothers very often would like to be just a mother, but in fact, they are more than a mother. They have so many roles, multiple roles here. I would like sometimes to be just a mother with my son. I want to feel like I'm a mother, not a nurse, social worker, integration officer, liaison officer. So, you know, it can change many things in her role. Concerning the paradox between autonomy, but you lose autonomy because the disease evolves. We hear that in the interviews I had with the mothers. There is a paradox between what a society expects from youth and the reality, because the disease is there all along the life of these children. What I mean here is that the paradox is always there. It's not just in one point in time during transition. It is there all along their life. A mother says, we work hard so that he becomes autonomy. But we work in that sense, but we are caught by the wave because it's a degenerative disease. He loses his capacity all the time. Yes, there is a paradox. The child grows up, he ages, becomes an adult, but finally it is always there because he loses capacities. I questioned mothers, how do you perceive the institutional environments? How do you perceive the workers' vision? And mothers answer that workers talk about functional autonomy. Here, they always ask, can you do this? Can you do that? Can you button up your shirt? Yes, he can do it, but it takes 20 minutes. And if I have to leave at 7 a.m., I have to button up the shirt. So mothers, they say that workers talk about physical and functional autonomy. Mother said that workers were putting a lot of pressure on the child and herself. On the child, so that the child could take decision without talking to the parent. Parents feel that workers have an individualistic vision of autonomy and not a relational vision. I took everything, all the results. I also looked at the reference framework and the issues, and many things you notice came out concerning their experience in transition. There are some differences in the study of Champagne and Mongeau. There were 7 elements. Mothers in my study didn't talk about the lack of preparation in adult care. They more or less talked about the meaning, looking for meaning, but they didn't. They talked about the paperwork or the burden, the administrative burden. In my the research of Champagne and Mongeau, the transition reactivates this feeling of isolation the parent felt when the diagnosis was announced. They felt isolated, but this came out again at the transition time. The topic of isolation came out mainly with the difficulty visiting the family members and the misunderstanding of family members. The search for information is key at the heart of the 2 researchers, and in my research too. In the 2 studies, target population is different. In mothers met have to work in a survival mode. And the mothers have also to cope with a very complex situation. The patients have a realistic vision of their child's autonomy and their role. They can name the limitation of the child, the care they need. They encourage him in many ways towards autonomy. They have a realistic vision of all the tasks they have to do to support the child, whether it is administrative or physical. When we analyze their words, we say that this is necessary for the child autonomy. The parent will use his own body to do the task, but they bear themselves this notion of autonomy. It's not constraints that are used by the child, but the parents are using their own body to express that. The vision of autonomy is not in line with the developmental perspective I showed you. In the ideal scenario, the young adult leaves the family home, but now the parent brings on a daily basis support to the child's sick life. Most of them were still at home, except one, but he came back to his home. However, it seems that the organizational culture of adult care is built around a model that revolves around the family life. Transition is a time where families are more vulnerable because they are under a lot of stress. Concerning their definition of autonomy, it is the biomedical aspect. But if we analyze what they say, they have a social model talking about the environment and so on. And they use the interdependent importance of the other person in a they have a rational, down-to-earth notion of autonomy because they see the importance of having other people in decision-making. They have the workers have a biomedical approach. They try to find alternatives. Some of my results show that sometimes objectives of some people and parents' objectives can be in contradiction around the maintenance of some capacity. I was talking about buttoning up the shirt, but there are other situations. So each child's situation in my sample was very complex and unique. None were similar. Some have cognitive limitations, others have post-secondary institutions, cégep, universities. So it's difficult to think that a unique transition model will be useful for all these children. So this talks about the tailored transition. Autonomy is seen as a key value and an ultimate goal. And there is this kind of induction to autonomy. In transition, the focus is put on this, on autonomy. However, authors, Racine and collaborators, they see the importance of adapting the transition process to the needs and also the narrative, the story of these youth and parents. So the question of autonomy is important if and only if it is relevant. Results of my thesis are along the same conclusion. Even if there is a paradox because of the disease, for the autonomy is not a major concern for the mothers I met during transition. The question of physical autonomy is a concern all along their life, basically. Even at 4 years old, they have the same concern. So mothers support the autonomy of their child way before they are 18, and they encourage them, and also they supplement for some actions and decisions. Autonomy is not the key at the moment of transition, and those mothers emphasize the importance of adapting the environment to support the autonomy of the child. So the key issue would be rather in the support measures and services the families receive, because we see a reduction of the respite care, for example. Results here say that a focus should be put on increasing support to the parents. It is difficult to think that the unique model would be useful, and I totally agree with Racine, and I invite you to read the paper. And I think I spoke a bit fast. There are a few minutes for questions if you have any. Thank you.
Bonjour, j'ai une question. Mon nom est Véronique.
I'm Véronique Gagnon from the rehab clinic for adults. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. In the context of transformation, we can talk about a shift in realities and relationships. Do you think that you will you continue your reflection and maybe bring not solutions like adding a lot of services, but to make it easier for transition when the child is adult? I said no, not adding services, but as a clinicians, as a team, to create bridges to allow training on accessibility to services. We cannot create services as a small clinic in Montreal versus I don't know about how to help a person overnight has to contact services, contact workers, needs to ask services and express their needs. How to include autonomy. I'm a coordinator in clinics, so how understand better my role, not my client is 18 years old. I know parents are there. They will always be there. I see the importance of being there and help. But there's this dichotomy saying, okay, now I need to have the consent of this young adult. This kind of transition for us is important to integrate or include what you said, but in some kind of a guide for stakeholders in a vision of users and partners, especially with our 18-year-old user or consumer. It's a very complex question. I have two hats. I'm a social worker and pediatric. We can have these questions at 14 years old about consent. So we have to navigate there. And I don't have a very clear answer to your question. We have to continue and think about it. I think that there are structural things that, as a small clinic, it is difficult to put in place when we talk about respite care resources. As workers, we have very little means. It is a reflection we need to continue to have. Let's keep in mind the parent. Don't forget the parent and the youth are also young adults. Unfortunately, I don't have a specific answer to your question. We should not just find a model, sit there, and put in place things. We need to go on a case-per-case basis because each situation is unique. It is difficult to try and have a single model that fits everyone. It's even more difficult when we have little resources. We talk about respite care, but these families were transferred here and there all over. These mothers used to say, I'm going in neurology, it's such a place, in physiatry and in rehab, it's such another place. So for such a thing, I go to the private care. So they have a very huge agenda with many, many places to go. And as a person, we have, in a small clinic, we have very little means how to accompany them. So that was a very good question. Would you have any thoughts? Anybody to answer the question?
Bonjour. Alors moi aussi, je suis.
Hello, I'm a social worker at Marie Enfant in pediatrics, like Noël. In pediatrics, we have work upstream to support the families and parents towards this transition. This is what we have to put in place, and we need maybe to inspire from other models that exist and adapt to each family we see and we meet. I'm Veronique's colleagues. So my question, what is the life of young people? We hear a lot about from mothers, what they say about transition. And what about them? What do they say about that? I didn't interview. Well, what I wanted to do, I wanted to interview parents. And she said, no, that's for PhD. On a master's degree, I chose to question parents. But I didn't interview the young adults. At the beginning, I talked about research that exists. Maybe I should go back to research I saw in Duchenne. I could meet you after. We could go through. I don't know where it was. Andemi and collaborator and Shrans, they did question the young adults, and they said yes. What they say was they had this, what we hear in society, we grow up, we become an adult, but it didn't fit in their actions. So this is what they noticed in this study. These documents are very interesting, and I could send them to you. But we need to continue and make research on transitions and question the young adults.
Merci.
Thank you.